Hey, what's up? It's Jared with Ditch Auto, and today I wanted to talk about the Canon 80D almost 3 years after it was launched. Now, the reason that I'm not waiting until February of 2019, which would mark 3 years after this camera being first available, is because Christmas season is upon us, and a lot of people buy a new camera or they're looking to invest in a new camera come holiday season because there's lots of activities going on, a lot of good milestone moments for your kids if you have kids and stuff like that. So people are really thinking about making a purchase around that time. There's lots of good deals that typically happen. And the Canon 80D is a camera that fits in all of those good deal categories often because it's definitely been around for a little while. But there's also tons of stuff for a Canon. I mean, Canon is like the iPhone of cameras. I mean, there's tons of accessories. Everybody makes something for a Canon camera. And so I wanted to talk about the 80D because the camera is getting a little old. Canon has not yet released like a 90D or whatever the next version is going to be. So is it still a good camera to buy in late 2018? I mean, is it worth the money considering there are a lot of other options out there? Like this it's a cheaper camera, but it's not a cheap camera. It's still relatively expensive. I mean, the body only is going to cost you around $1,000, and the kit with the lens, which is what you're looking at right here, is going to cost you around $1,200. So the camera itself is still a fantastic camera. It takes beautiful photos, it's extremely fast, the autofocus is great. There are a lot of really good features of this camera that have stood the test of time. However, there are some things that a lot of other cameras have these days that this camera does not have. So let's start out by talking about the areas in which this camera still shine and what makes it a great camera in 2018. Now, I'm going to talk about photography features, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about video as well. So we'll start out with photography. Now, Canon has always had really great autofocus, and the 80D is definitely really good at autofocus, even in some of those lower light situations. Though this camera doesn't perform as good as a 5D does in lower light situations, and some of the other cameras that are out there on the market now, the 80D does a really decent job in lower light situations for photography. It struggles a little bit in video, where lower light situations become a bit trickier for the sensor on these cameras, but it still does a pretty decent job and if you compare it to a lot of the other cameras out there that are even available today. Features of this camera: the 80D has a pop-up flash, which is great for those of you that just want a really versatile camera. On higher end cameras, they take that away, and for good purpose. There are flash attachments that you can get that go right into the hot shoe that are going to do a much better job than the pop-up flash. But this camera sits kind of in the middle. People ask, like, is the Canon 80D a professional camera? Well, it takes photos at the level of a professional if you know what you're doing with the camera. So you really have to understand photography well to get professional images out of this camera. But even if you are just an occasional shooter, you're probably going to be shooting in automatic mode or one of those automatic assisted modes. The camera still does a fantastic job, and Canon has always been really good at that, those auto assisted modes, and really being able to nail exposure, being able to pull focus on whatever your subject is. Canon cameras have always been pretty decent at that. There are some things that I typically do in my setup of the camera, and there's a video that I did quite a while ago on the top settings that I change on this camera. So definitely check that out, because in that video I go through some of those settings that I found that were extremely useful to change to make this camera even better than it already is. So with that said, I mean, this camera has the pop-up flash. It is not a full frame camera, it's a crop sensor camera. And basically what that means is that the sensor is not a 35mm equivalent. When your sensor is a full frame sensor, say you buy a 50mm lens, you're getting 50mm out of that lens. Whereas with the crop sensor, that puts a crop factor on your image, and a 50mm lens is going to be more like a 70, 72, I can't remember the exact, but there's going to be more zoom essentially in that in the use of that lens. So with this lens right here, this is the kit lens that came with this camera. It's an 18mm to 135mm. So the actual range that I'm getting out of this lens is more in the 30 to 200 or high 100s. I'm not sure exactly. I'm sure I could have Google searched it and figured it out. But it is a little bit different, and so it's worth understanding that, because a lot of people may think, okay, well, what would be the best lens to get for this camera? And they think, oh, a 50mm lens, but in reality, that 50mm lens is acting more like a 70mm lens. So it's just something to keep in mind, that this is a crop sensor camera. It's not a full frame camera, even though the sensor looks relatively large on it, because a lot of other cameras out there have sensors that even look smaller than this because they're smaller cameras. This is a crop sensor camera, but it is also very much a camera that can be used professionally. One of the things that I've always said to people when they're asking me about whether or not a camera, how much money they should spend on a camera, what camera they should get, so I always recommend that they get a camera that has the features that they need, but also spend their money on lenses first. Anything that you put in front of your camera is going to limit the camera's ability to be great, to capture great images, to capture sharp images that are a good looking image from edge to edge. And so if you put cheap lenses on a good camera, so say for example, you went out and bought the Canon 1DX, very high-end camera that cost $6,000 or something like that, and then all you had was enough money to put a kit lens on it, which this kit lens wouldn't work on a full-frame camera, but to put a more entry-level lens on it, you're essentially choking down that camera's ability to take fantastic images. Canon 80D is an amazing camera that can take beautiful photos, but it really comes down to the quality of the glass that you put in front of it. Now, if you decided to spend $1,000 on a camera like this and spend $1,500 on a good lens for it, you're going to get amazing photos out of this camera, even though this camera is almost 3 years old, even though there are much better and faster cameras out there that have came out since. So if you're considering Canon and going in the direction of Canon, I recommend, and if this is new to you, DSLR cameras, I recommend going with a camera body that is maybe a little bit cheaper than what you can afford, but spend some of that extra money on good glass, on a good lens. Now this kit lens, there's some really interesting things that that Canon started doing with this lens. It has the ability to work in some form of a zoom system that Canon built. It's an attachment that goes on the bottom for focus and zoom. I've never played with that. But this lens is supposed to work really good with their autofocusing system that they implemented a few years prior to this camera in video form. So autofocus has always been really good with Canon in photography, but when it comes to video has always been tricky with autofocus. And Canon really kind of put themselves out there as the leaders initially in cameras like these, DSLR style type of cameras, having really good autofocus in video mode. The touchscreen on the back of the camera also really sets this camera apart, as even some of the higher end Canon cameras are just now getting those features. The touchscreen on the back allows you to be able to adjust focus, whether you're shooting photo or video, and actually lock that focus, or if you're shooting video, to start focus on a subject that might be like in your foreground, and then tap to have that focus move to a subject that's in your background. Like, those are really cool features that Canon kind of brought to the table first, and they actually did a really good job, even though they were much earlier than some of these other manufacturers in some of these cool features. One of the other things that Canon has been known for is their articulating viewfinder on the back of the camera. And so you tend to see this camera used a lot in vlogging. People that are doing video blogs or vlogs that are posted to YouTube and whatnot like this camera, because the screen articulates and actually points forward towards me. So if I was holding this camera out in front of me, I could make sure that I'm framed up correctly because I can see the image right here. Most other cameras do not have a screen that articulates in this way, and that's what sets this camera apart as being unique. Even still, almost 3 years later, and this being a huge feature for people that are vlogging, for people who tend to want to take more like selfie photos and stuff like that with their DSLR, huge feature that most camera manufacturers still are not listening to, and that's why the Canon 80D is still selling so well almost 3 years later. So the articulating screen is fantastic. It's something Canon's been known for a long time. And while we transition to start talking about video features, and then I'll end this video with some things that are good but not great about the camera. The camera also has a mic input and headphone output so that you can monitor your audio levels. That's really important for people who are filming and wanting to use this to shoot video. You need to be able to have some better way of getting audio in, like mounting a Rode VideoMic Pro or something like that on top of the camera, but then also being able to plug in headphones so you can monitor your audio levels and make sure that your audio isn't clipping or that you're not having any problems there. Very important things, and a lot of cameras in this price point do not have that. I shot a lot with the Sony A6500s, and a lot of those cameras of that size, mirrorless cameras and whatnot, they have an audio input, but they don't have an audio output for me to monitor and for me to hear the levels and make sure everything sounds good. So Canon has given that to us. Yes, this camera is quite a large camera in comparison to a lot of the other cameras that are out there in this price range, especially the mirrorless cameras. The mirrorless cameras are way smaller than this camera, but you're not going to find some of the features that this camera has in some of those smaller cameras. That's why there's an audio input but no audio output on a lot of them. Some of them don't even have an audio input, so you have to rely on just the basic built-in microphone that's in the camera, which we all know is not going to produce good quality audio. So another thing that a bigger camera does is it's solid and it feels good in the hand. It's easy to hold on to because there's a bit more of the camera body here. And when you're shooting video and you need to be as stable as possible, especially if you're shooting handheld, you need more to hold on to and a little bit of weight so that you can better hold the camera still. Too light of a camera is going to bounce around in your hands a little bit. It's going to be hard to hold still. Too heavy of a camera is going to be hard to hold over a long period of time. So if you're shooting video, it's really important to have lenses that have internal image stabilization, such as this kit lens has really good internal stabilization. A lot of Canon lenses have fantastic stabilization. The one thing that this camera does not have is any form of sensor stabilization. So far, Canon hasn't really entered into that space of adding stabilization to the sensor like Sony has. So that's maybe a downfall of this camera. Another feature that this camera does not have is 4K shooting. So the Canon 80D does not shoot in 4K. It only shoots in 1080p. It does a really good job of producing beautiful 1080p content. So as long as you are okay with that and you're not really looking into shooting 4K, it doesn't really matter. A lot of our content is still being delivered in 1080p. Editing 4K footage, because everything I shoot is in 4K, is a lot of work, and sometimes I think I should just shoot 1080 because it's so much less of a problem when it comes to editing it. You can edit it on a computer with less power. Editing on a laptop is so much easier when it's 1080 footage as opposed to 4K footage. So there's a lot to be said there as to whether or not we need to be shooting everything in 4K yet, but this camera doesn't shoot it, so that might be a decision-making factor for you there. Another thing is it has one single SD card slot right here, which for some people is a problem, for other people is not. Me as a professional, when I go out and shoot and get paid to shoot, I want to make sure that I have backups happening right away and that I have a fail-safe in place. So shooting everything to one card means you have one single point of failure, which is not that great. You don't want to have a single point of failure. You want to make sure that you have backups, and of course, anything can happen, but you want to mitigate that as much as possible by shooting with equipment that has options for you, like dual card slots where your photos or your video clips are being written to both cards at the same time. That does minimize a little bit of the potential risk, but to be completely honest with you, in all of the years that I've been shooting, as long as I keep a relatively, well-maintained camera and I shoot with cards that are not cheap budget cards, I spend a decent amount of money on my SD cards, and I'll link in the description below to anything that I mentioned in this video, but definitely check out the cards that I use because I never have any problems with these cards. I use the cards for about 2 years and then I get rid of them. A lot of times you can go and sell your cards on eBay for relatively cheap. Just make sure you format them well. before you send them off. You can sell those cards and then buy new cards, so I'm always constantly trading out my cards for newer versions, and that mitigates also the risk of cards just failing, because of course everything fails as it gets older, but with the SD cards, because I'm constantly getting new ones every year, every couple of years, my cards don't get that old. They don't have a chance to fail. So as far as video goes, the 80D still kind of is a fantastic camera for shooting video, because it just does so many things right at such a good price point. The autofocus is so good that you just can't beat it, really. I mean, a lot of the other cameras are just now catching up to the abilities that the 80D had a few years ago. So one of the things that will happen with the 80D as a new version will probably come out within the next year is that the 80D will get cheaper, just like the 70D did and the 60D did. And I really do hope that they bring 4K to the next version of this camera, because it would just be great to see that. I think it's time for them to bring that to the table. So as far as photo and video go, this camera has just always been a great performer. It's the only Canon camera that I have left in my arsenal. I shoot all on Sony now, but I kept this camera because there are some things that it does really well. First of all, the autofocus was just exceptional. It's one of those cameras where you can set it on a tripod and it's going to autofocus and track things that are going on better than a lot of my other cameras. Of course, some of the Sonys are now catching up, but the Canon 80D just did it, and it did it well, and it's been doing it well for a long time, and it's something that I could rely on. Also, in photo booths, I would typically do a photo booth from time to time, and this camera goes direct to printer, and you can actually print from the camera to a printer much easier than you can on a lot of other cameras, especially the Sonys, and so I hung on to it for that. I also just absolutely love picking up this camera and using it every now and then because it helps keep me connected to Canon cameras, which I still have a love for. I didn't trade my allegiance completely. I still love Canon equipment and the stuff that they do. I'm just shooting Sony now. I just wanted to try a different platform, and I decided to stick with it for a while. I also absolutely still love the Canon battery platform. The batteries that Canon created so many years ago just have a fantastic battery life, and other cameras are just now catching up, especially some of these more power hungry cameras like the mirrorless cameras that are shooting 4K and stuff like that. So with that said, I mean, the Canon 80D I think is still worth the money that they charge for it, because it's a fantastic camera. It is missing a few key features that I think cameras these days come with for that price point, such as 4K shooting and stuff like that. But there's even cameras coming out these days with some of those features that are not completely stable, whereas the 80D is stable in pretty much all situations. You're not going to run into any problems with a camera like this, whereas some other cameras with those new fandangled features sometimes fail and don't always work up to the standards that you would hope. So the 80D really is like a bulletproof camera, and that's one of the things that I think Canon has kind of been known for. Of course, lately they've been releasing some new products that may need a little bit more time to bake in the oven, but as far as the 80D goes and the cameras that have came before it, they've been fantastic, strong, durable, resilient, able to work really hard and last a long time. I've had this camera coming up on 3 years now. I don't use it a whole lot, but when I do use it, it does the job for me and gets it done every single time. So I've got some links down in the description below for you to things that I mentioned in this video, as well as some other accessories that I've used with my 80D that I think are just add to the experience. Like I said, Canon, there's a lot of accessories, a lot of great things out there for Canon cameras that are specific to this camera because it's been out for so long. There's been a lot of really neat things developed for it. So I'll share a few of those with you down in the comment section below. Let me know what you think about the 80D in the comment section. I will add the links to the description of the video, but down in the comment section, let me know what you think about the 80D. Do you have one? Are you considering buying one, but maybe you're considering another camera as well? Let me know your thoughts on it, being that this camera has been out for a while. How well do you think it's held up over the years by the standards that we all have as far as cameras go? Share that with me down in the comments. I'll be down there hanging out, waiting to have some talks with all of you and share our opinions, because that's what the comment section's for. So that's going to do it for this video. Thanks so much for checking it out. I have one other video that I'm going to do with the Canon 80D, but I'm going to do it over at State of Tech. I'm actually going to take the 80D and compare it to the iPhone XS Max and the Pixel 3 and the Note 9, because those phones cost about the same amount as this camera. And the conversation really is turning towards, do we need a DSLR camera? Can we just do everything with a smartphone? And so I think it's going to be a real interesting video to see the photo comparison and the video comparison between both. So if you're interested in stuff like that, make sure to head on over to State of Tech and check that out. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Click on that subscribe button so you can be notified when we put out new videos. And I appreciate you being here today. We'll see you in the next one here on Ditch Auto. Take care.